Chapter 23, The 1920s, Coping with Change, 1920 to 1929. Fueled by new products and new ways of producing and selling goods, the economy surged in the 1920s. Not everyone benefited, and farmers suffered severe economic woes. Still, the overall picture appeared rosy. These economic changes influenced the decade's social, political, and cultural climate as Americans confronted a changing society. This is a 1925 railroad poster advertising Lake Michigan beaches near Chicago. The Roaring Twenties were the prosperity decade. It began with a brief post-war recession, but new consumer products, sophisticated advertising, and innovative forms of corporate organization drove the economy forward. New technology, electric appliances, and especially the automobile changed America. New assembly line techniques raised per capita industrial output. Recognizing that workers were also consumers, many capitalists saw the advantages of increasing workers' purchasing power. Mass distribution of goods, chain stores, installment buying, and advertising on the radio and in mass media, especially in magazines, helped to stimulate consumerism. Agriculture did not share in this economic boom, however, and on the whole, organized labor floundered during the 1920s. You can see on this chart, Index of Industrial Production, the brief dip after World War I, followed by the significant increase throughout the 20s. This is the look at car production. You can see on the left millions of cars and the massive spike as you get into the 1920s. This is spearheaded by the likes of Henry Ford and his Ford plant in Detroit. A couple things to note on the timeline politically. You can see Warren G. Harding is elected in 1920, and his slogan was to return to normalcy. A little later, you see Harding actually dies. Calvin Coolidge becomes president. Silent Cal, as he was known, was really a hands-off president. He felt that the president wasn't there to try to shape any type of reform. So he had a very laissez-faire style. Coolidge would win again in 1924, and eventually the Republicans with Herbert Hoover would win in 1928, right before the major crash, which would usher in the Great Depression. This picture is entitled, "Honey, Where Did You Park the Car?" Hundreds of identical Fords jammed Nantasket Beach near Boston on a 4th of July in the early 1920s. Here you see advertising from the 1920s. In this 1920 ad, a bride contemplates the thrill of owning her very own electric washing machine. Pay only a few dollars down, the ad promised, and the balance in convenient monthly sums. The Republican Party in power got its major support from northern farmers, corporate leaders, small business persons, and some skilled workers. Democrats drew their support from the white South and the political machines of the immigrant cities. President Harding's notably corrupt administration was followed by that of Silent Cal Coolidge. The scandal of the era was the Teapot Dome scandal. Interior Secretary Fall went to jail for leasing government oil reserves, one of which was in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to oil men in return for a $400,000 bribe. Isolationism marked the foreign policy of the period. One notable diplomatic achievement was the Washington Naval Conference. After the war ended, the United States, Great Britain, and Japan edged toward a dangerous and costly naval arms race. In 1921, Secretary of State Hughes called a Washington Conference to address this problem. He startled the delegates by outlining a specific ratio of warships among the world's naval powers. Great Britain, Japan, Italy, and France accepted Hughes's plan and agreed to halt battleship construction for 10 years. Another U.S. peace initiative was mainly symbolic. In 1928, the United States and France, eventually joined by 60 other nations, signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, renouncing aggression and outlawing war. Lacking enforcement mechanisms, the high-sounding document accomplished little. Among women, the progressive spirit that had encouraged support for child labor laws, protection of women workers, and federal support for education seemed to have dissipated. women, now voters, responded to the conservative political climate and materialistic mass culture of the day. Here's a picture of President Harding with his dog Laddie in June of 1922. As politicians learned the arts of publicity, post scenes like this became more common. This is an image of leaders of a League of Women Voters at the White House. With the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, both parties courted women voters. The outfits of these women suggest, however, that they were mainly from the upper class. American culture became increasingly urban in the 1920s. Americans were still attached to rural and small-town values, however, even as more of them moved to the cities. Widespread automobile ownership, while making possible forays into the countryside, also made possible greater individual independence and diminished family cohesion. Mass culture was growing more and more standardized. This was an era of jazz, raucous parties, bootleg liquor, and sex, the last perhaps more talked about than acted on. Certainly, Hollywood sex scandals caused quite a stir, as they both enhanced the public fascination with the movies and led to an increasing outcry from both private and government sources to regulate public morality. Celebrity worship perhaps crested in response to Charles Lindbergh, a daredevil stunt pilot who flew solo across the Atlantic in a small single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, on May 20th through the 21st in 1927. You can see the intersection of urban and rural populations starts right in 1920 and continues to grow to a more urban population. This had profound political, economic, and social consequences. This graph highlights the African American urban population from 1880 to 1960 in millions. The increase in America's urban black population from under 1 million in 1880 to nearly 14 million by 1960 represents one of the great rural-urban migrations of modern history. This is also known as the Great Migration. This is an image of radio the early years in 1925. To promote the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, radio station WJZ in New York City offered an hour-long broadcast of circus sounds, including the bellowing of Dolly, a 2-year-old elephant. This is an image of silent movie star Billy Dove. This scene is from Dove's 1928 film Night Watch with Donald Reed. The same year she made Adoration with Antonio Moreno. Such torrid scenes help explain why moralists and religious leaders of the 1920s found the movie so alarming. American life in the 1920s involved more than politics, assembly lines, and celebrity worship. Young people savored the post-war moment as ingrained pieties and traditional ways faced challenges. As writers, artists, and musicians embraced the modernist spirit of cultural innovation, African Americans created a cultural flowering known as the Harlem Renaissance. Here's an image of F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda. While Fitzgerald chronicled the 1920s in his fiction, such as The Great Gatsby, he and Zelda lived the high life in New York, Paris, and the French Riviera. The New Woman phenomenon involved not only feminist activism, but also young women's career and lifestyle choices. The so-called flapper look spread across Europe and the Americas thanks to movies, fashion journals, and women's magazines. The sports world welcomed young women too. This is an image of French tennis star Suzanne Lenglen at England's Wimbledon Stadium in the early 1920s. With her short tennis outfits and fondness for sipping brandy between sets, Lenglen offered one version of the international New Women of the 1920s. This is an image of Langston Hughes, poet of the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes was part of the African American cultural and political awakening of the 1920s that foreshadowed changes ahead. Jazz was also hugely popular in the 1920s and would eventually be known as the Jazz Age. Rooted in New Orleans black culture, jazz gained broad popularity in the 1920s, especially among young cultural rebels, as caricatured in this 1926 magazine cover. The accelerated pace of change and the shift of values led to a series of cultural battles that tore at American society. The welcoming door for immigrants from Europe and Asia was nearly closed by Congress in the 1920s. Thousands of Mexicans moved north to find work in the United States. The nativist impulse of the immigration restriction movement erupted even more strongly in a revived and powerful Ku Klux Klan. In the South, the Klan had an anti-black emphasis. In the North, it was anti-Catholic. Everywhere, it promised to restore the nation to an imagined earlier purity. When the corruption of the Klan leadership was finally revealed, the movement disintegrated. Discontented with the poverty and racism, many Africans were attracted to Marcus Garvey's UNIA. This is also referred to as the Back to Africa movement. Meanwhile, the political consciousness of African Americans expanded in response to the activities of such organizations as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Urban League, and the National Association of Colored Women. Still, another rejection of modernity was revealed in the Scopes anti-evolution trial, in the anti-radical and nativist emphasis of the Sacco and Vanzetti case. The Prohibition experiment with the 18th Amendment can also be considered a failure. Violations of the ban on liquor became widespread, and organized crime dealing in illegal liquor grew bolder. In a brazen display of power, the Ku Klux Klan organized a march in the nation's capital in 1926. By this time, the Klan was already in decline, however. This shows a Universal Negro Improvement Association parade, the UNIA, in New York's Harlem in 1924. Marcus Garvey's association attracted many African Americans in the 1920s. The banner reads, "The new Negro has no fear." The decade ended with the presidency of Herbert Hoover, an able and gifted man who, unlike Harding and Coolidge, did not uncritically cheer for big business. While Hoover did not spurn industry, he believed strongly in the self-governing responsibility of business. He argued that capitalism had broad social obligations, but he believed most of all in voluntarism and opposed government economic intervention. While his efforts were limited by the commercial and political realities of the day, Hoover did make some early government commitments to pollution control, sustainable fishing, and hydroelectric power, notably the Hoover Dam, that would help to guide future government policies. His presidency overall is viewed as one of the worst, however, due to the fact that the Great Depression was soon on the horizon. Exploiting the latest in film technology, the 1928 Republican presidential campaign used sound motion pictures to promote Herbert Hoover's candidacy. Although Hoover won every state but Massachusetts and 6 deep South states, Smith's 1928 vote in the Midwestern Farm Belt and the nation's largest cities showed significant gains for the Democratic Party over 1924. One thing you can see on this is the significant increase in voting for the Democratic Party among blacks and other immigrant groups. The prosperity of the 1920s ended in October 1929 with the stock market collapse. The Wall Street crash and the economic problems that underlay it launched a depression that hit every household. President Hoover struggled to respond, but his commitment to private initiative and his horror of direct federal intervention limited his effectiveness. In November 1932, voters turned to the Democratic Party and its leader, Franklin Roosevelt. This set the stage for a vast federal response to the economic and social crisis.